Thank you very much. Like I said, my name is Jonathan Teubner. I'm speaking to you today from Cambridge, Mass. Here we're in Harvard Square. I'd like to speak to you today about how we're leveraging some of this open source data to gain some insights on how everyday Russians feel and are thinking about Putin's war. So the background here is, really this kind of question is, and it's kind of one about getting, good, reliable, and current data on Russia. This is obviously a challenge many of us share, and it was actually made much more difficult on March 3rd when Russia cut off the Western social media and some key news outlets, because these aren't only like lucrative revenue streams for these companies, they're actually vital sources of population data that people rely upon. So this kind of created this really significant knowledge gap for many, including journalists trying to report on how Russians think and feel about this war, and of course, strategic comms professionals who are attempting to persuade key parts of Putin's regime to stop supporting the war. So the question really became like, how do we get something similar to this information? So let me take you back a few years to where I was working and trying to solve a very similar problem in a very different context. So back in between about 2010 to 2018, there were a lot of efforts in and around Pakistan to try to use some social media data, some alternative data sets to understand kind of the local populations. We were working particularly in Lahore and trying to understand these various groups and trying to help aid agencies, NGOs understand who's going to be open to partnership and what are they thinking and feeling. But the challenge there was, and this was kind of a time when there was great experimentation among a lot of technology providers in this space to use some of this social media data, this alternative data, some things that you might harvest from news sites and message boards. But the social media data was very attractive at this point to use to understand populations. However, that was unrepresentative of people there, and it was kind of spotty at best. So with a team of kind of data scientists, researchers, and some practitioners at the University of Virginia, we started developing a set of tools to identify trusted and localized open source data to be able to establish some ground truth, identify certain partners, and track changes in community sentiment more broadly. This was largely experimental at this point, and I think we were starting to kind of pioneer a lot of alternative sources and different signals that you'd need to understand student groups and what they were talking on, relatively openly on message boards, as well as kind of harvesting some of the religious communities and their information about how they were kind of talking about other groups. We weren't particularly concerned at any point in time about what their actual commitments were, of course, but we wanted to know what are the broader social and political themes they were talking about and the populations that they represent cared about. This was something, like I said, it was kind of an experiment at this point. And part of it was that there was as I kind of mentioned, there was already some solutions that were starting to emerge here. That what I kind of bucket these two in very general approaches, some automated solutions and some manual solutions. For the automated solutions, these are, like I mentioned, the social media, and a lot of countries will, and locations around, surprisingly, will have news aggregators or ways that you can create a news aggregation pretty quickly. And these are convenient and well-structured data sources that someone can plug into and get kind of real-time data over populations. However, like I mentioned, they're generally very biased towards major metropolitan areas. They're dependent upon who's on the platform in a lot of cases. So it's biased by kind of very online users. And increasingly, a lot of these are filled with inauthentic accounts and, like I mentioned, representative of some geographies and communities. And so what people were doing at this point when it became a little bit more obvious how lacking these sources were, they started to kind of like return to a lot of manual solutions and trying to supplement some of that data with subject matter experts, consultants, and then surveys, particularly like opinion polls and those. Obviously, we can talk a little bit about opinion polls in Russia, which is a fascinating topic under normal conditions and even more so today. But the problem with those is that it's very costly. A group to like put some of that in the field or like bring on a subject matter expert or consultant takes a lot of, it's pretty expensive. It's difficult to integrate with the other data, and the information they give you is quickly out of date. So what we were kind of doing, and this is where we were kind of starting when we were at the University of Virginia to try to get some of that alternative data out there into a structure that can be integrated with this other data to supplement it more often. But the problem that we kind of hadn't solved, and really like Filter Labs was created to solve, was how to be able to like capture that granularity of what some of those like highly local understandings that you could get with the scalability of some of the existing automated solutions. And what the real challenge at many points in time wasn't that it was trying to get something like subject matter experts' views into a form to integrate with it, was rather that the sources of the subject matter would rely upon to inform his or her judgment over it were highly dispersed web data. And those are data that sits out there in unique URLs. And that became a manual process. And it still is today for the vast majority of firms out there who are trying to understand populations. They're having to go get URLs and put them on. And so what Filter Labs, a lot of our core technology has been developing, has been actually kind of automating the data discovery process and the ingestion technology. And then we use some of our proprietary natural language processing algorithms to provide a new structured data feed. So basically, create data feeds like you'd get out of a news aggregator or social media platform, but with all this highly dispersed web data. And that was the problem about at the University of Virginia, we were doing this in Pakistan, we were struggling to do that in a timely way. And that's where kind of the breakthrough we made here. So what is it that we're actually looking at when we're out there? This is a list. It's not exhaustive and it's not relevant to every location, but these are types of sources that we are scaling here. So, and this is kind of like where in Russia, particularly some of these popular forums, particularly those about cars, are rich with data and community level conversation. A lot of cities have dedicated forums where there's a significant number of people talking about it. And of course, these Telegram groups, which everyone knows about and their relevance. And then you can see some of the blogs and business associations and other entities out there that'll put up web data that'll be up there and will update relatively frequently. And so what we have been doing there has been kind of like using our spidering and scraping technology to go in and grab that information and structure it in such a way that it can then be integrated and kind of presented and reported to people who are interested in that. So let me say a little bit more about at the high level about this process itself. The kind of the big challenge I think that I think is clear here is actually the data discovery challenge. It's like actually going out there in an automated way and finding highly dispersed web data. Russia's web is what we kind of try to remind people is Russia's web space is not yet the same as China's. It's regulated rather in like maybe you might call a top-down fashion, where there's central sets of URLs that are banned, and it's not kind of, whereas like China has more of a bottom-up, a local kind of policing of these, kind of through the kind of actual, IP addresses. Whereas, so what we kind of see is there's a lot of a lot of URLs and web kind of pages out there that really are kind of unpoliced altogether, and people are using them, but they're just kind of hard to find, and and there's a part where they talk for a bit and then it goes silent. So you have to find a new one. So you're always having to discover new data there. And that's what we've been kind of doing, is kind of this continual process of discovering new sites. We then scrape that artifact data, and we deploy kind of language specific sentiment and keyword analyzers on top of that. And that helps us structure the data in such a way that it can be integrated with existing data sets. And then our analysis layer here is something that these are kind of some of our proprietary signals trying to detect pro and anti-bias. One that we have particularly is trying to understand pro and anti-Kremlin bias within very specific web forums. We look at key issues, trending topics, and influencer identification. We are not generally pulling back everyone's personal identifying information. We're only pulling back those names that are actually appended to something like a news article or a blog post. So those people putting themselves forward are the ones who we will retain their names over, but everyone else, we kind of let that go, because what we're trying to identify are people who actually move the conversation, not just individual people who are moved by the conversation. And then we report this through different ways. And we have data APIs as well as a dashboard here that I'll give you a brief overview. And this is where, with most of the partners that we're working with in this space, particularly in the Russia space, are on the dashboard. This is a web app that we've developed that they can go in and kind of filter down to see what's kind of in very specific geographies throughout Russia, what are the key issues there, and they can identify that. Who are the people talking about? What are the outlets out there that are talking about these issues? And then tracking the sentiment around those issues in key parts. And so this kind of allows them to really see kind of fine tune their messaging there, as well as starting to track the progress of their messaging. And this can be done both at a local level to say, I just want to look at something like Cherpovets or Pskov or wherever, and then it can be kind of aggregated to more of a national level. And that can also work across various layers of forums. So if you want to see the impact within a certain set of forums that people are using, you can track that. Or if you're wanting to see it in another kind of topic matter, you can see that. So a little bit of the use cases here about who's kind of looking at this and who's what they're doing. So I've said we're mainly helping right now journalists and strategic comms professionals, really trying to understand and connect with these hard to reach audiences. And that's a little bit so the first thing that we do is track these everyday issues that drive behavior. One thing that we've learned through all of this is that while the support for the war remains, we think, kind of the majority of Russians, we see no indication that the majority of Russians do not support the war. Let me say it that way. But we see a lot of indications about parts of the war and the consequences of it are driving a lot of people nuts. And there's a lot of negativity towards it. One thing that we tracked early on was around conscription or the draft. That even though there's broad support for the war, there was great negativity towards the draft, and basically the way I summed it up to one person was, Russians are fine with this war. They're a little bit hesitant, and they're not so sure about the direction of the casualties. But when it comes to the draft, absolutely not. My son should not go to the war, and we should not have that. So it's kind of the war is an okay thing when it's distant, from Russians, but when it comes up and presses into their life, there's a greater hesitation. And so those are some of the themes that we track here, whether those are, issues like the draft or things about the supply of medicine or, food supplies and things like that. And we think we're going to see some of those themes continue to emerge there as the sanctions regime will start to bite on more of the everyday Russians. So that's one thing that we're doing there. The other is kind of identifying some of these local influencers there who are on it, not and some of this has to do with since when we're trying to encourage people to message on these kind of more everyday themes, there's a greater range of actual people out there who are willing to talk about it. You're not just simply trying to find more people to say bad things about the war. You're trying to find more people to say various things about the consequences of the war itself. And then you're kind of looking at assess and impact in real time, just tracking community sentiments. And so some people are using that to understand the impact of the messages. Obviously, a lot of journalists aren't necessarily in the business of the act of persuasion. In that case, they're more in the act of reporting on it, and they just want to know, where do people stand on these issues? And we partner with some news organizations to help them kind of understand that and where it is at the moment. So just briefly here, I think this is the last subsequent slide I have, is just kind of a short thing about one group we're working with, a Ukrainian group, Open Minds Institute. And what we've kind of done with them, and this is where they've been doing some targeted messaging campaigns. We kind of we've got them on our dashboard, and they're able to create reports and look at that and start to filter down to see certain topics that they should be pressing on, and then designing campaigns in their own way using a range of messaging tactics, whether that's SMS, email, social media, and then then following the impact of that in specific geographies, as well as more over the national kind of conversation, but how you might actually move this opinion. Is it moving in the right direction? Should they be pressing into some issue that's already trending negatively, such that and that's part of what we kind of talk through with a lot of partners about, at what point are you really trying to tilt at windmills here, or do you really need to start catch some waves and figure out where it can move people? And then we provide them, like I said, these analytics to track the impact of their messaging.